Welcome back to Leviathan Rising. I'm Chris Wyden. I gotta say, thank you to everyone listening to the show so far. I'm pumped you're here and excited that we get to walk through this world together. Give us the stars and keep an eye out online. Who knows what else we'll start doing soon. Okay, enough of that. Hope you dig this week's episode. The title is Dolly P. I'm Chris Wyden, and this is Leviathan Rising. The darkness seemed to rumble up around her. Dolly looked down at her dangling feet. They were smooth, nimble, and her toenails were painted with a magnificent sparkling turquoise color. "Your favorite dress," the voice of her own memory prompted from a space beyond this one. The back of her hands looked younger than she remembered, and her calves too were shockingly unaged. Dolly's lips curved in unexpected delight at this apparent anatomical development. She found it curious that she could see anything at all in this place in which she found herself floating. A black, timeless void. The void rumbled again. A jolting series of impacts seemed to start beneath her feet and then echo around her. Dolly's eyes opened in the dim light of her room. She was no stranger to being roused awake in the pitch of night, so she always had a low lamp burning in the distant corner. As her eyes adjusted and her brain surfaced from the void, she felt the rumble again. "Rumble, rumble," said a mocking inner voice from her unconscious. Her brow furrowed as she tried to recall what she had just seen in her dream, but it melted from her mind as she turned her attention to it. Dolly lay there for a moment, hoping to drift back to wherever she had just come from, and for however long her slumber would be permitted to continue. Her eyes gazed upward aimlessly, and that's when she noticed the chandelier above her bed was swinging. It was electric, so it was functionally useless, but Dolly found it charming, so it was left alone when she took the place over. "Rumble, rumble," her mind called quietly as her eyes followed the fixture's gentle sway. Bang! The whole house shook, and Dolly was on her feet in seconds. Shouting voices were followed by gunshots. "Brat-a-tat! Brat-a-tat!" Feet charged up the stairs, and new voices started shouting, followed by another gunshot from underneath the northwest corner of her bedroom, where the kitchen entrance would be. Frank, thought Dolly. She recognized the sound of his revolver. That one shot, followed by the present stillness, indicated that very little ground had been made upon the invaders' entry, if there even were invaders. She turned toward her door, more confident now, but then it opened. Nicholas leaned his head into the room, locking eyes with Dolly. Dolly exhaled in relief. "Who?" she said. "The Monticellis," he responded. More gunshots echoed from downstairs, but this time followed by sounds of anguish. "How the fuck did this happen?" said Dolly curtly, a fury already boiling before the crisis was handled. Nicholas ignored her question. "We're handling it." He shut the door. Dolly exhaled again, trying to calm the mix of fear and anger she felt coiling around her throat. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. She looked down at her feet. They were more wrinkled and spotted than she had expected, and she found this expectation surprisingly unexpected as well. Dolly rubbed her right temple. Then there was an explosion. Dolly dropped to the ground in an instinctual panic as the entire house adjusted its weight on the foundations. Her lamp tumbled from the corner table, spilling oil out onto the hardwood floor. As the pooling liquid ignited, Dolly hit her feet. Not without a little clumsiness, she haltingly ripped the comforter from her bed and threw it over the newly lit flames. The thick blanket came down like a dropping curtain, plunging the whole bedroom into darkness. Dolly rolled her eyes at the void, a flicker of a memory itching behind her forehead. "Fuck this," she muttered. She turned to her left, arms outstretched, and approached her door. After feeling her way to the wall, it only took a few attempts to locate the handle. Now in the hallway, Dolly strode toward the stairs. Well, at least that's one fire out, she thought. Her anxiety from moments before evaporated. She let it be replaced by a ferocious discontentment at having another unwelcome fire still burning. Dolly reached the top of the stairs and opened the cigar cabinet positioned there. She retrieved an old Glock 21 from inside, checked the magazine, and turned down the stairs. Thoughts of the 90s filled Dolly's head. Maybe it was because she had been asleep less than 8 minutes ago, or maybe it was just because of the old gun in her hand. Images of Jennifer Aniston and celebrated eating disorders in Yugoslavia. Dolly stopped at the bottom of the stairs, refocusing on how pissed she was about her current situation. It had been quiet since the explosion, or at least Dolly wasn't picking up much sound since then. She flicked the safety off and stood still in the downstairs hallway. In front of her was a swinging door that led into the kitchen. "All clear!" It was Frank's voice. Dolly let out a sigh of relief and pushed through the door. The kitchen was large and symmetrical, with another swinging door situated opposite the one through which Dolly had just passed. On the other side would be the living room where the family would meet, or where Dolly would entertain. Not that that really happened much. "The grenade got 'em all!" Frank called. Dolly's face tightened with irritation. "Great, Frank. How much of the house did it get, dumbass?" Frank's pleased expression darkened. "Sorry, ma'am. I was just trying to be efficient." Dolly smiled tightly at Frank and patted him on the shoulder. She had a reputation for ferocity, but worked hard to maintain a positive environment for her people. She reserved her anger for the outsiders who tested her. But this time, it wasn't outsiders. The Monticelli family had lived in the Milwaukee area since before the state legislature fled, even before Dolly rose to the top of the heap. Pushing through the door, Dolly arrived on the scene. Tony and George were in the living room. Nicholas was somewhere. George went through the pockets of two men lying on the floor. Semi-automatic rifles were limp in their hands. Uncovering a pack of cigarettes, and a lighter to boot, George paused for a moment to indulge. He looked up over his newly lit ember as the door swung closed behind Dolly. Then he tossed the pack across the room. Dolly caught it and fixed herself a tobacco treat as well. Despite Frank's grenade, the room wasn't blown open to the world, and Tony and George looked relatively unharmed. Tony sat on a couch several feet away. He tended to a wound in his bicep, dislodging a bullet trapped there with a large pair of tweezers. Tony had already applied a tourniquet using his waist belt. As he tugged, the bullet came free and dropped with a quiet thud on the rug. Dolly turned toward the wall that separated this room from the kitchen. There was a large dresser there, adorned with gas lamps and photographs. In the top drawer, she located this room's first aid kit. "Frank said he threw a grenade in here," she said to the two men. George and Tony chuckled, and then George responded, "It was a flashbang, but it was the right move. Gave us the opening we needed to take him out." "You fellas should make sure he knows what a grenade looks like for next time." Dolly approached Tony, and he let her wrap his arm as George finished plundering everything reusable from the Monticelli corpses. Calmed by the unfortunately routine action of dressing a wound, Dolly spoke to her fellows with an even tone. "Okay. Somebody should tell me what the hell just happened." George and Tony traded expressions. "Monty Monticelli wants to be you," George said matter-of-factly. Dolly was surprised that she had to suppress a smirk. Sure, Monty Monticelli is a stupid-ass sounding name, but she had had to hear those syllables uttered so many times now that she thought the comedic novelty had worn off. But what, little Monty wants to make a move now? I never took him for a man of action. He's more of a rat, waiting for his turn atop the turd pile. George continued, "Well, that's just the thing, boss. Monty ain't working alone on this one." Tony chimed in as Dolly finished up with his arm. "Yeah, word is he's partnering up with some folks from outside Chicago now." Dolly looked up and stopped wrapping Tony's arm. He looked at Dolly, but her mind had left the building. Clumsily, he used his free hand to finish the wrap. He did an okay job. "I thought Chicago was off the table now," Dolly said absently. George started talking about someone named Sal in eastern Iowa, but Dolly wasn't listening anymore. Her mind wandered into the past. Maybe she was still waking up a little, but regardless, her mind couldn't help but relive some of it. She used to be a lowly enforcer back then. The Chicago outfit had been in charge, and they used to run Milwaukee like a feudal king ruling over his vassals. But despite the outfit's hold on power, they fell quickly into disarray after Tiffany and Queenie took out the eastern seaboard. Chicago suddenly experienced the biggest influx of migrants in its history, and the mafia, along with everyone else, was completely overwhelmed. At first, this chaos generated a number of lucrative opportunities for the outfit, but the migration wasn't just of people. DC needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and in the interim, the federal government decided that Chicago would make a fine temporary home. As the largest eastern city that hadn't been destroyed by one of the hurricanes, it made the most sense on short notice. The feds were, of course, disorganized and less focused on crime than they had been before, but still the increased presence of the FBI threw a wrench in the outfit's normal day-to-day. And to make matters worse for them, it was at this time that the captains and underbosses outside of Chicago started to test their boundaries. Dolly wasn't part of this first wave of rebellion, which was good because most of them were made an example of. But then the solar flares took out the grid across the country. It was only for a few weeks in the more populated areas, and the outfit briefly thrived in a manic spur of activity that would have been impossible under the city's normal systems of surveillance. But this was short-lived, and in the following months after power returned to Chicago, the outfit all but disintegrated. Some say that DC came back online pretty quick, despite the damage sustained from Tiffany a few years prior. But even so, the feds had been limping onward since the destruction of the East Coast, and this new crisis was apparently insurmountable for them, even if no one noticed at first. In this period of darkness, the United States changed their leadership and slowly began to morph into something else. Many states were already heading towards secession, and this shift led to a more rapid splintering of the former U.S. Emerging from the wreckage as the inheritor of America's institutions and its arsenal was what became known as the American Republic, and this new regime made Chicago its seat of power. And this new government was much less forgiving than the former U.S. The new constitution they ratified was also far less concerned with the rights of the people it governed. It no longer mattered if the outfit's illicit conduct could be proven, just if its members could be arrested. The arrests came in a deluge, and the trials were fast. It was during this rapid demise that Dolly Puccini took the reins in Milwaukee. As a sort of joke, her crew started calling her Dolly P. This was a reference to the long-dead outfit boss, Salvatore De Laurentiis, whose nickname had been Solly D. But Dolly tried to rule with substantially more leniency than the outfit had allowed. Dolly wanted to make sure that her people felt like Milwaukee had been freed, rather than traded from one boss to another. But it had become increasingly difficult to keep the good times going over the years. At first, Wisconsin was effectively abandoned by the new republic. Dolly thrived in this setting, taking up the position of de facto provider of both salvation and discipline for the Milwaukee area. But now that the American Republic was trying to expand its territory surrounding Illinois, times had grown more difficult. Several of the trade routes with western towns and cities had been blocked, and even though the border towns had been putting up an impressive defense, the Republic inched closer and closer to Milwaukee each day. And now this. Dolly snapped back into the present. George was still talking, but Dolly interrupted. More to herself than to George. It makes sense, I guess. I would be doing the same if I were in their shoes. It's just like when the outfit came apart. The Republic comes in and the whole balance of power gets destabilized. George nodded. I'm sorry, George, Dolly said. I wasn't listening. Can you repeat that? Thank you for listening to Leviathan Rising. If you're enjoying the show, please rate us on your podcast app. It's a huge help. To keep up with us online, our social media accounts are linked in the episode description. If you want to send us a note, our email is in there too. Leviathan Rising is created by Chris Wyden. Music is composed and produced by Travis Paul.